service, private cloud, hybrid cloud, or whatever, brings up a number of questions, both from just a service management standpoint, an enterprise architectural standpoint, a IT management standpoint, and fundamentally, one of the main questions that we seem to be asked is what are the security ramifications and how do they apply to doing some of the basic of IT service management and other basic IT disciplines. So to that end, we have a fairly illustrious panel that I'll be introducing here in a moment, but even before I do that, I'd like to point out some of the people that have made all this, this whole organization possible. People like Steve Smith, standing in the back there. Steve, even though he has a lot of other things going on, really does give a lot of his time to make everything work here for this organization. I appreciate that. And Jeff Richards, also another heavy-duty lifter for making things happen here in this organization, and he heads up the Sinn CIO group, as well as another group called Office of the CIO that we can talk about more later. And also Larry here from eBay. I think most of you know Larry, and Larry is the one that we want to thank for all that wonderful food out there and for this great facility. So thank you, Larry Cassidy.
Thank you.
And there's Brenda and a number of other people here that I'd like to really point out. Robin from the Silicon Valley Soccer Group, and a lot of great people here. Paul Hoekstra, who, as you may know, was the recipient of the IT Service Manager of the Year Award this past year at our national event. And so he was our most honored practitioner. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel here very briefly. So we've got Pat Heim. Pat was the McKesson CISO, and then for many years now has been CISO over at Kaiser CISO. Done some very interesting things over there, conquered a lot of major challenges. And then Mike Wilson. Mike, we really appreciate your driving all the way down here, very much. And Mike is the current CISO for McKesson Corporation. And as you know, that's one of our older and more revered companies in San Francisco, and they're doing some very interesting things to help all of us from a health standpoint that we're going to be talking about more as we talk about the cloud or implications of it. And then Richard Sinn. Richard wants us to just call him just an architect, but he's a lot more than that here at eBay. And we appreciate your coming as well, Richard. He's also a professor at San Jose State for security and a noted author in software security. And of course, Leslie. Leslie, thank you for coming. Leslie was the CISO for Sun, and currently is the CISO for Juniper Networks. And appreciate her coming. And John was the CISO for Expedia, and there was another company after, and
Prior to that, I was VP of IT operations for Hotwire.
For Hotwire. And currently he's working with the Office of the CIO here locally. We'll talk about more later. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick this thing off. Now to start things, we've kind of compiled a list of some of the questions that some of you have been asking. And we felt that might be a good way to start this out. And always when we start these things, I always like to tell people that the reason for this event is to help you in your careers and your jobs and to give you something that you can actually use tomorrow when you go back to the office. And so if we're not covering things that meet that goal, you need to raise your hand and ask more questions of something that you need to know to be able to do a better job tomorrow and get more credit for it. So some of the things that we thought that might get things kicked off here were, and I'm just going to read the first one here, and then we'll address it in the panel, and then we'll kind of go through these. They start pretty basic, and they get a little bit more involved and more controversial as we go on. And we want this to be iterative, right? So we're going to ask the panel, and then you guys should be raising your hand saying, well, what about this, and what about that, kind of a thing. So the first thing is, what are the greatest security threats facing cloud instances today? A, are they different from public versus private, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS clouds? Are they control fundamentals still important? Well, of course they are, and it begs the question, but let's just run through that really quick with the panel. Starting with Pat.
So I think when we think about threats to the cloud, I think it's more threats to your business. And the threat you face, I think, is going to depend on the business that you're in. If you're a government contractor in the defense industry, it's probably a foreign government intelligence agency that's your biggest threat, whether it's cloud-hosted services or your infrastructure. I don't know if that makes any difference. If you're a organization that's processing credit cards, financial information, chances are it's criminal networks. And if you're doing something that's controversial, chances are activists that are going to come after you, as we've seen recently. The other wrinkle of this is that there is something special around the cloud. And that is that where does your organization begin and end? It starts getting blurred. Almost everyone here has some kind of Gmail account, Hotmail, or whatever it may be, which, now the trendy term is it's a cloud-hosted service. What we are seeing, what I've seen personally, is that when an attack is executed, it isn't just directly against the organization anymore. They will leverage your personal cloud assets to do reconnaissance, to map out social networks, to understand who influences you, who they should be going after. They will try to compromise your personal email accounts, other passwords that may be related, to get the information that will eventually get them to their final objective within your environment. So if you do it from that side of it, I would say the personal cloud has a strong influence on the security of your corporate infrastructure, whether you're in the cloud from an official corporate perspective or not.
Thank you, Ansel. So in sort of preparing for this, it was helpful. Mike Mazulafay sent a white paper out from Gartner, because I'm sitting there thinking, what are the risks of the cloud, right? And so where do you start? A lot of different articles and things out there, and I think Gartner sort of simplified it. So I'm just going to sort of level set this a little bit and probably steal everybody's thunder on the article you sent out. But the 5 or 6 areas that are sort of highlighted in the article that you sent out, like privileged access, right? So how do we manage privileged access when you don't know who's managing it for you, right? So that's a fairly fundamental issue, because people are asking. Who are asking? Well, regulators are asking, lawyers are asking, customers are asking, and so we get into this whole sort of compliance area, right? We all have to deal with investigations. And so getting some sense of, if you will, e-discovery and all these sort of legal terms and such, they're complicated by the cloud, particularly as it relates to data. Okay? And then data, hot on that topic, data segregation. And so as much as an intermediary like McKesson for a customer, I guess in some cases like a Kaiser or another organisation, Pat will come along and say, hey Mike, where's my data? Well, it's with that provider, we think. Where is it? It's in this country, we think. Is it close or next to anybody else's data, like my competitor? No, we think. So you can see the complexity that we've got in answering those types of questions. And fundamentally, I think that's sort of a practical way of describing it, given the thunder on the article you sent out, Mike, so thanks for that. I've got a couple of other comments, but I'm going to feed them into the rest of the discussion. Into my next colleague.
Sure. I'll flip the coin a little bit. So before at eBay, I was actually at Yahoo doing security architect, serving the segments a little bit different with 250 million users. And I remember back then, just only 3 to 4 years ago, it is a forbidden topic to talk about what would happen if you have botnet attack. So we cannot write it down because there's not much that we can actually do. And we know that university traditionally how they do it is they compromise one machine in the lab, and then they actually span off and actually get one lab off the university and they spread from one another. And at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. to wake up, do a search query to Google or Yahoo, and then do analytics or bad things with it. So with the cloud, I would say one of the most interesting security problems that happens in the next 2 years or so will be abusive behavior where you can use cloud to attack any web application of your choice. So you can go to EC2 and then actually go to Amazon, $300, you can buy and create a botnet that is very sophisticated with first-class infrastructure in the back end. You can launch attacks that way. So that would be the one that I would say it's actually pretty significant moving forwards. And it's made popular by the Sony events when people do the diagnostics. They use EC2 to launch it. But actually last year, a lot of worms have been actually spread across the internet. How they usually do is they fish your passwords and then they wake up into command centers, which we collect the password and send it over to command centers. Traditionally, the command centers actually in Nigeria or some ISP which are doing that. Now, a high percentage of them is actually going into EC2 because you can buy one and then collect those data and so on. So the second one I would think of is probably the inside, the bad administrators scenarios. So when you sign up a cloud providers, they give you all this literature saying, we'll keep your hypervisor secure, we'll keep everything secure so one tenant can get to another's, and so on. But how true is that? So before you actually farm out your applications, you have to actually think through those issues. So one of the things that actually recently hit the news is Dropbox. So they said that, when you actually put a file in, we ensure in marketing materials everything is encrypted and so on. But what they find out is internally, any random employees or a lot of random employees inside a company can decrypt your file and look at your data. So before you farm out into any cloud applications, those are the security problems that you will have to think through before you go on.
Okay, I see. What else is there left to say? Well, when you're going to go out to the cloud, or in the old days, I guess before we had cloud, we did a lot of things called outsourcing, or business process outsourcing, and things like that. And what's really looked at is, to risk the brand reputation, the reputation of your company. Typically when you're still owning all of it together, then you're managing all of that. And then the minute you step outside and you begin to extend your enterprise or extend your company, extend the footprint out to different types of providers, like a cloud provider, then you may have the most wonderful security scheme within your company, provide all of those great levels of data protection to all of your most critical data assets, and yet now you're connected to something that's the weakly link. And so I think as we're all, as cloud providers are becoming more and more pervasive, some of the things that we have to demand of them is, tremendous levels of certainty regarding the security hygiene of what they are doing, and allowing us, in some sense, some visibility to them, because I know that, of course, they don't want us to come in and open up the cabinets and see everything, because that's part of their secret sauce and all that. But in some sense, if you, it's not necessarily specifically a cloud provider, but if some of you received the emails regarding the Epsilon event that occurred earlier this year, where their systems were breached. It was a data breach, but they were the sort of a managed service provider of email services, what we call marketing services, for just hundreds and hundreds of companies. And myself, I received 3 or 4 of those emails saying, dear customer, we're very sorry, our provider, Epsilon, was breached and your data was breached. So I guess we all just sit and wait. I don't know what you do with those emails other than file them or delete them or something like that. So anyway, so I guess the point I would make is, your own company's reputation and brand reputation will be then linked to whomever it is that you connect yourself with from a cloud point of view.
And in fact, I wonder if that ties in with some of the things that have been happening at Sony, as an example. And if we could just sort of stop there and maybe jump over that. Pat, you were talking about, what seemed to you to be a pattern where Anonymous and some of the other hacker communities. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, just looking at it, the common wisdom recently has been that, the kids that grew up in their mother's basement and were hacking internet sites and defacing them kind of now have to move out and pay for bills and went to the criminal side to make money out of it. But what we're seeing now is almost like a growth or a resurgence in more of the activist side and people just doing it for the fun of it. And it's not too many data points, just the last several months or so with LulzSec and some of the attacks from Anonymous that we're seeing. But looking at that trend, what's really troubling from the Sony perspective is not the sophistication of the attack, but the persistent nature of it, where looks like they are purposely spacing out attacks against Sony about a week apart or so, or a couple of days apart, to really coincide with the press cycle that's out there. So if I want to destroy the reputation of a company, I know that a single event doesn't have a huge impact because the media has attention deficit disorder. You know, they have a story and then they'll move on. So it's an interesting strategy if you think about it. Well, if I know the ADV time span to get that front page article is 3 to 5 days, why not hack it every 3 to 5 days? And the reality is that they may have already been compromised multiple times. It's just that they've kept it quiet and they're doing incremental releases. So it's that, if you were thinking about that sophistication of the attack coming from an activist organization or just kids wanting to have fun, I think it's all a retribution of, I believe, Sony going after a specific hacker who broke some of the digital rights management of the PlayStation 3. If you think about that, you know, it's a total disproportionate attack, but logically it doesn't apply in this case. But the sophistication of it almost has me thinking maybe there's something more behind it.
And wasn't that a scenario where some of the basics that someone could have been doing around security, weren't handled? And that's one of the messages that we want to try to get out tonight to you guys, is that for your own systems when you get back, please pay attention to some of the basics that we've talked to tonight, because they will help protect you.
I think the biggest lesson that comes out of the Sony experience is, you see what happens when you don't have a CISO? But in all honesty, that's the level of seriousness that they put to the security operations. And now you're seeing this, all the costs punching up throughout all of their systems. You know, they're getting these very fast. Kind of add on, I think the difference between the current generation activists and previous is that the current generation is much more media savvy. Much more media savvy. And I mean, they know, and they write the story before they do the hack, and they go find the contextual data that they want to fulfill that storyline that they've created, and then they pop that out. And they've got the media connections now, obviously.
And they're able to get media sympathy.
Yep.
These
They're freedom fighters. They're not criminals.
Yeah, one of the articles I saw today was that Anonymous has now warned NATO to don't mess with us. And that's typically the precursor to Anonymous then messing with their target. So we'll see what happens in the next few days or weeks. Whether NATO is actually infiltrated somehow by Anonymous, if they aren't already.
And it points out again, they get that cycle going, warn. It's like, you know, you see the presidential candidate, not a candidate, excuse me, potential presidential candidate is going to make an announcement potentially about his candidacy next week. So now we have a week's worth of talking about how he's going to be a presidential candidate next week, and then he announces, of course, he's going to the cycle. They're doing that same sort of thing there. The other thing, this is not just a hacktivist issue that it brings to the fore, it's the asymmetrical warfare issue. You know, if in fact they're going to go after NATO, I mean, you know, obviously guns and bullets are not going to do too good. But they may very well have the potential to create severe problems for NATO and their cyber infrastructure.
So one of the next questions.
Share
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, since before you move off, Sony, I read a quote from the CEO who said, in the past, my involvement with information technology was to approve their budgets and approve their projects. Now I realize that I should be more involved. And I wondered what exactly that meant. And so what I'd like to ask all of you is, if you could advise the Sony CEO exactly how should he get involved with IT, what should his specific involvement be, I'd be very interested in hearing that.
Are we not allowed to use 4-letter words? Well, I'll just make a brief comment, then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Gee, I don't know. You know, if I was, you know, when you have the family checkbook, right? You know, kind of follow where some of the money is going. You know, if you're running obviously a global organization like Sony, you know, tremendous market value, and think about it, the entire new wave of all of the media things that Sony is delivering, much of them are delivered through, their delivery vehicle is information technology. So why would you not have a close eye on that, since that's one of your channels? You see what I mean? So it's the old think of that IT is, it's that annoyance, it's those people over there at the help desk, but it's a channel for them now. So stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
I mean, my observation is that, I don't know Sony, I don't know how they organise themselves, but if I was to think in the context of McKesson, it's a large company, and we've got large companies in this room, right? And many of you will have larger companies from an employee standpoint. Others have other complexities, I'm sure. So our complexity is it's a very federated company, if you will, sort of like a holding company, really, with lots of businesses that do interesting things to support health, be it on the technology side and on the distribution and pharmaceutical side. So you pop into a Safeway, you pop into a Walmart, you have a product in the pharmaceutical aisle that we delivered. We're very proud of that. So a CEO that has to think about arguably one of the largest supply chains in this country, a CEO that has to think about the board, a CEO that has investor calls, a CEO that has operation business plans, a CEO that's probably from a sales and marketing background and not an operations background. They pay us to handle this stuff. And the CIO, there's a role for that. That's a role, right? And that's why that role is what it is. And so yes, the CEO needs to be engaged and ask the right questions. And maybe what are those questions? And perhaps we need to make that dialogue a little bit more interactive. But my memory is at least service management is all about, was it IT as a business or something, right? Financial transparency. And, well, maybe some of the operational transparency pieces, and security is one of those, not the only one. Change management is a key thing around all of this. Good old solid project management is probably another one. IT governance. A lot of these issues are not really security. How do you organise yourself? Right? And so I have sympathy for the CEO, but at the end of the day, the buck stops, right? And what scares me about Sony is I would be lying if I said I didn't think it would happen to us. And I think if there's anybody in this room that has a view that it couldn't happen to them, and at least Sony as a brand, McKesson doesn't really have a consumer brand, Juniper's kind of in between, but perhaps the Kaiser a little bit more friendly, and definitely an eBay, I'd be very nervous, but I mean, so the more consumer oriented you are, the more out there your brand is, I think you're more of a target perhaps. So there.
Yes, Rob.
I just want to make a general comment because I think the Bay Area is the smallest place on earth. So, so many people in this room have kind of professionally grown up in your organizations. And seeing that in a company, in a place, now Kaiser's had its horrible events, But, the reality is we have grown up in your world, watching you refine your risk models and isolate, the extent to which a damaging event could reach. And I think what was really horrifying about this is the reach. How many devices were out there without knowledge that that device was secure? And I can tell you that I don't think there's a risk of McKesson making this kind of mistake, only because of experience with the Kaisers and the McKessons. You simply have built a model that wouldn't allow it to reach that kind of proportion.
And I won't allow that debate to actually move me down the path to try to convince you the opposite, because I would agree with you. I think some companies have far more consumer-facing situations and candidly perhaps more breadth in terms of impact on the consumer. Where you have devices and
when you look at the web trust, distrust era, and what just you two gentlemen alone, and I don't mean to in any way discredit Juniper or Yahoo or eBay, I'm just saying that some of this is just absurd. You have that four-letter word does pop in your head where you say, really? Maybe it's because it was PlayStations and it wasn't incubators and it wasn't drugs and it wasn't,
how it addresses your point. What I want the CEO to do is recognize the contribution we are making to protecting the value of the brand. So there's a huge get on that. Once he recognizes that, then he needs to commit to us that he will support us in our efforts to protect the value of the brand. And in so doing, he will give us the resources that we need such that we can, if we're properly managed, properly governed, reach out to that level of advice. But for so often, we just, at least I didn't have all the resources necessary to hit every person in that organization that was all across the globe. And that's why I live in fear, is you only need one.
Let me be a little pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. So pessimism first. If I look what's happened for technology, the rate of acceleration is incredible. Security, compliance, best practices, they're trailing behind. The other element that I'm seeing is that if you think of technologies as layers, we'll use an example that used to be, you had a Unix box and maybe a database somewhere, and you had your CGI application written in C sitting on top underneath a web server, and that was it, that was the complexity. And you had individuals that actually knew the applications end to end, basically, how everything worked. Nowadays, you look at it, you have hypervisors, virtual machines, you have middleware layers, you have AJAX applications that are being developed on the client side. You have incredible layers of complexity that are being inserted that aid in the development, they aid in the manageability, they reduce the cost. But if you look at it as a stack, and you think about it, every element of the stack has to talk to every other element at some point in time. And that's a trust relationship, and that's a potential point to attack. And the attack surface, I guess is the technical term, has increased dramatically in a corporate environment. And because there's so much complexity associated with this, and that's my favorite part, what you have is subject matter specialists that only know something at a very specific horizontal level, be it the database person, but he doesn't know what the application is doing, or the app developer who really doesn't know anything about how it's being integrated and what platform it's running on, etc. The German term for this is called Fachidioten, subject matter idiots. And I'm not calling them idiots, but we have these specialists now that we're relying on. But very few people, I think, have a very credible, deep end-to-end understanding from the physical and network stack all the way up through the application itself, how it works together. And I'm postulating that that increase in complexity and the need of relying on subject matter experts that don't have stack visibility anymore is increasing the attack surface and is increasing the opportunity for, frankly, more and more events in the corporate side. Now, let me flip that around to the optimistic side, is if we look at cloud, and we've been talking about security risks in cloud, I think there's a security opportunity. Because cloud computing is fundamentally based on economics of having standardized units. You're not going to have the variation that you have in a corporate environment. You have standardized components that, for the sake of profitability, are simplified to the greatest extent possible, high degree of centralized management. They're all going to get updated at the same time. There's a fair amount of discipline there because it's the company's business to run that cloud, to keep it up and to keep it secure, which is slightly different motivators potentially than what you would find in a corporate space. And it's a more homogeneous and a more modern infrastructure. So if I look at it from that complexity again, I'm viewing kind of as the emerging cloud technologies to some extent being more securable than internal corporate IT environments if the trends continue the way they currently are. And as a cloud provider, I can hire the best people on the application security side, a handful of those basic network folks, whereas most other companies are not able to scale to tap that very limited skill set of highly technical and competent security professionals that are out there. Cloud provider may actually be able to do it. So what I'm going to forecast is that in a couple of years, we're going to see kind of an influx, a point where the compromises in traditional corporate environments will continue to increase. There will be a frustration, maybe a continued loss of trust in those. Whereas the cloud providers that really focus on securing the cloud, actively doing that strategically, and see it as a business enabler, will be able to position themselves and raise their hand and say that we are demonstrably more secure than if you were to manage this in-house. So get over hugging your warm servers in your own data centers. We can prove that we're better.
But isn't the monolithic nature of that architecture a sitting target for hackers?
It is. Yeah, so I mean, there's the old argument that monoculture, basically, once you get in, you eventually get in. So, like I said, it's multiple years, it's going to have to evolve. The cloud has a long way to go in terms of transparency, whether it's logs and monitoring. There will probably have to be a number of ancillary services, so transformations in how you manage IT. I fundamentally think that the role of information security is going to be much more of an in-depth monitoring role, and making sure that once those APIs, and once you have that transparency into your service providers that are out there, that you continue to test and maintain and provide that degree of oversight into it. So there's going to be a fundamental change in how we run IT.
We're really making a case for standardization, right, through maybe clouds or internal. Right? If you allow multiple experts to fuss around with your applications and databases and what have you, right, then one can make the point where internally you never know what happens, right? So further standardization internally will speak to that point as well.
I think it has to do with, really strong, hardened configurations that are then standardized on. And then the hygiene activities around that to keep that, the post-configuration management to keep that. I love all this like configuration drift. What configurations drift? I've just never understood that. Post-configuration.
Customer does for something else.
No, because people go and fuss with things and they say, oh, we haven't touched
Yeah,
it.
so as long as you don't allow people to fuss with it, right, when you set a standard, right, then there can only be one standard, and you enforce the standard, right, you increase the likelihood of security.
So I think what we're saying is that security will be the differentiator for the cloud providers.
And what I'm saying is, like, in the balance, basically, we're all saying the same thing on standardization. I just don't have a lot of faith that most companies are going to be able to aggressively standardize, maintain things up to date. The philosophy in most large companies I've seen is what I call refrigerator IT. You make a capital investment, you plug it in the wall, you try not to touch it, you minimize your maintenance activities on that, and then 3 to 5 years out, when it's depreciated, you rip it out and you replace it, which is a completely different philosophy than really one of continuous maintenance, having flexible systems moving around. It's a completely different philosophy that if you adopt that in a large corporation, you adopt the cloud way of thinking, then and with good controls, then I think you can get there. But I don't see most large organizations evolved in their thinking, and they don't have the financial
Not
practice to
necessarily
be able to do
on the
that.
business system side, right, because you do appreciate, of course, your investments in it, right, because you have your year-over-year license. So you do have a long-term relationship with those.
Yeah, so in terms of architecture, what you can actually do is, when you actually pick what to actually deploy in the cloud, what you can do is you just look at the applications that you're going to put it on, and then look at the datas that these applications would do. And you can use a classic multi-level security structures and say, I have public datas, internal datas, confidential datas, and restricted datas. And all the public datas will go onto public clouds. Internal data will be multi-tenant under the firewall, behind the firewall with internal clouds. And then restricted and confidential will be actually inside. So that would be your base rule for your architectures. And then after that, you lay out a little slider and say, here's risk and here's cost saving. And you basically slide between them and see which one you actually want to go. So if you want to slide one way, you can actually put internal data's application to be the public cloud and take the hits or the risk of actually doing that. Or you can slide back and say, I don't want anything in the public cloud, and actually go into
How do you implement that? And how does that take place in company?
So in this case, without disclosing anything, so what happened is you can do a different hybrid approach to actually do that. Going to outside, actually good consulting company outside now can actually federate it between different public cloud plus internal deployment. So if you look at how the EC2 instance go down is, the EC2 actually pitched to you that if you have available zones that you actually replicate from one side to another, when it goes down, the people who actually try to create servers and get a snapshot actually come back into it, find out that for hours that cannot be done. You cannot spin a server. So what you need to do is actually go from one zone to another, and then you hope that they will actually come back. That also doesn't work. So what people find out is you actually have to have a live replica outside of the public cloud. So when everything goes to hell on one vendors, you can actually switch either internally or integrate another public cloud. So you can actually do a little hybrid switching.
And I think one of the things that at least organizationally or operationally or something, is, you know, when Richard was talking about the slider, what I was imagining, and then you talked about the different tiers of data, and I use those same before, so, yeah. That it's going to require that, let me start with that. So all of our business users, all of our friends have been really, really lazy for years, right? Oh, you're going to take care of that for me. Oh, it's on the server, it's backed up. So, you know, let me just do a little straw poll. How many of you have clear data classification inside of your companies?
You're not asking if we actually use it, right? Just
Okay, all right, let me start. Document labeling. Okay, that's like the crudest form, right? So document. So, okay, not too many people raised your hands. So what this requires is, though, if you're going to say, you know, my most restricted data is going to be like in the vault, I have to know what that is. I have to know which of my, you know, petabytes, terabytes of data is actually that important, because otherwise everybody gets the same treatment. Every piece of data gets the same treatment. Too much or too little.
So Steve has been waiting patiently to ask a question.
Well, I had to take off what Pat was saying. I wanted to make things. And that was that I think that there's a bridge between what security traditionally does in terms of their monitoring systems and making sure that the infrastructure is sound and secure, et cetera, and the more contemporary forms of IT service management. There's a, for organizations that have moved forward pretty heavily on it, the CMS has become the configuration management systems have become a major tool in terms of understanding what's connected in your organization, how it works, being able to monitor it and so forth. So it's kind of a central device that sits out there, if you want to call it a device, that's capable of doing the kinds of things in terms of the complexity of the organizations and technology that we're seeing now in a fairly reasonable way. I think it lags way behind what the clouds need. Obviously, it's not anywhere close to that. But I'm interested in the panel's opinion on liaisoning with IT service management organizations in your companies to set up systems like this. Because I see them as being critical to really understanding not only what the costs of running a business are, IT as a business, but understanding how they're being managed, who's managing them, and how they're connected, and especially in a dynamic environment like this, with virtual servers and routers and everything else that's going to be virtualized down the road.
I left Kaiser recently, but one of my projects that I was very, very passionate around is really asking that question around, do we know where the data is? That's a whole interesting initiative. The other part of it is just, do we know what our systems are and what they're doing, basically? So there's a huge degree of tie-in between configuration management, asset management, whatever. We have all of these different elements, and I was thinking about it, it's like, there's no coherent data model that ties it all together. It's a bunch of isolated products operating in silos right now that really don't share data that well. And I've got my own security where we have security scanners, and Active Directory is certainly verbose in, but not the Unix ones potentially. And those are maintained in the DNS. So there isn't a comprehensive view of the physical assets, the logical assets, the licensing assets, and extend on that identities, for example. Especially as we start talking about some of the automated kind of the interconnections between various layers of the stack itself. So I see it as kind of a huge smelly elephant on the table that many companies really haven't tackled. Now add on to that now, all of a sudden, virtualization slash, say you're bringing up a cloud environment where it's infrastructure as a service and you're spinning up new machines, assigning IP addresses, host names, and everything else to it. How many of your enterprise tools are designed for that type of dynamic environment?
Yeah.
Most things kind of assume kind of you have a couple of primary keys, including things like IP address or MAC address or processor ID, whatever it may be. All of that stuff is ephemeral in an environment that's highly virtualized. I'm not that close to it, but again, back to the vision of the unified data model. I don't think anybody's pulled it together. There aren't any standards that I know of, at least, that help all of these different point products that have been purchased to deal with different elements of security and systems management to actually kind of normalize the data and pull it together into a single view.
I agree, and that's why I'm bringing this up, because I see that the collaboration between the two disciplines, if you will, being able to reconcile a great deal of this, because I can't see security doing it by itself. I just don't think it's feasible. However, with the tools of the more contemporary tools of IT service management and the training, it's catching up and it's doing a good job, but it's still far behind. There are companies out there trying to do cloud stuff, but I think it's a very interesting idea or way of thinking about collaboration between the two.
Yeah, I think absolutely so. So, all right, so since I already did one straw poll, let me do another one. How many of you have a configuration management database or configuration management system? Okay, about half the room. Why don't the rest of you? So, for me, and I worked at Sun Microsystems for a long time, and now at Juniper, and I see both organizations, high technology, both companies selling products into the, critical national infrastructure of our country and things like that. And I wonder, why are we still so kind of sloppy with the way that we're keeping track of the information assets and the compute assets and logical assets that we have, servicing our very large and important companies. I think of it like let's take the case of finance, okay? So finance is a profession. People go into finance work, accounting, whatever. And in their systems, they have things like chart of accounts and general ledger and all of these really organized way of saying, this goes here and we spend it against this. It's not just like the giant petty cash drawer, right? Just the pile. So, geez, I'm lobbying for IT and security to be a profession. Service management, I think, is one of the best opportunities to help with that, is to say, as professionals, why wouldn't we have our same chart of what we have, the assets we have, and then if we know what we have, then whether we went to a cloud or not, we would still be able to manage those assets better.
I think we should do some kind of award for that leading question, because that's really what we stand for at IT service management. I know a lot of us, when we first go in, we take a look at the processes, make sure there's actual documentation for the process. Usually there isn't. We set up monitoring so that we can actually govern it and pay people to do the job they're supposed to be doing. We work with enterprise architect to make sure that we have a limited number of business functions and that we only have IT services serving those functions. Anything else is superfluous. We cut out the tools that are superfluous, and then we start to lock down the processes and continuously improve them. That's what we stand for here. And that's one of the reasons that I at least wanted to see this happen tonight, is that a lot of the things that are done, locking down processes, enable a greater level of security, and there's some of the things that people are going after right now with breaches.
They also enable a greater opportunity for insecurity in the fact that, we are looking at this and we're all saying you and we and all this stuff, and we're thinking of it as ourselves as IT management professionals. Well, I had an instance today with a global company who had a subsidiary, who was working with another subsidiary, who was working with corporate IS, and they found out that this third subsidiary way out there in England had spun up an Amazon E2 instance on their own, with no involvement of IT, no knowledge of IT, just to say, hey, $300, I can do it, no problem. How did they find out about this? Because within 24 hours, that system was hacked, owned, and consuming way too much bandwidth from Amazon. Amazon picked up on it and notified the parent company that there was a problem with this instance. So while I agree that we have all these wonderful things about how we are going to upgrade our management skills, unfortunately, a lot of the tasks that we are looking to manage are getting sucked out of our realm and put directly into the hands of the business. And to me, it's kind of like the analogy I always use in business. I'm a good cook. I cook real well. If you want to come over, I'll cook you a meal that's good. But that doesn't mean I can run a successful restaurant. But the businesses, they think they're good at business, and they can spin up a server like this by spending $300 with Amazon, and by golly, they can do that. They can run that instance. We've done a lousy job as IT professionals of educating the business about what it is that the big boys in IT do, and why we say, oh, before you do this, why do we take so long? Why do we cost so much? Because we know all the other stuff that has to be done that they don't think about.
It's a little bit of an engineer response that I hear, right? Like it's on or it's off. And I think there has to be a nuance in between, right? Like the businesses that we are in, right? We're running like crazy, right? We're going really fast. We have to respond to the latest idea in marketing, the latest idea in sales, the latest best practice in driving up customer operations, right? But then there's the infrastructure side, what we want to lock down and get economy of scale, right? And one of the things that we see with ITSM, right, sometimes there's, and it's not a criticism, it's an opportunity to improve, right? When you start in the lockdown process, you lose your flexibility. Yeah? And what the business will do is, they're going to grab their American Express, right? And they're going to get a cloud, right? So the only way that, as an IT professional, we can compete with that, right, is to provide a better service.
That's right.
Right?
And
And
that's
we
part of
we are
business
incapable of
relationship
articulating where that is, and I think security is a great driver for that.
But it goes beyond providing a better service, because we do provide a better service. We do think about locking down.
Not according to your customer, of course, they're going to...
The customer got hacked. They got hacked because they bought a lesser service, a service that installed an instance of Oracle with a default username and a default password and an SSH file, scanning the internet, picked it up, and nailed it. We provide a better service. When we spin up an Oracle instance, we change the default username. We change the default password. We do all of the things that we know need to be done as professionals. What we don't do, and the point I'm trying to make, is we don't do a good job of educating the business of the full value of the service we're providing. So they look at that other service, they say, it's quick, it's cheap, I can do it, and I don't have to deal with these IT guys who are a pain in the butt, because they know it needs to be done for the job to be done successfully.
But do we do a good job of partnering with them and saying, okay, you need this, or you want this? I, from security, see these flaws. How can we mitigate these security risks and give you what you need? Because my guess is that's where we have an opportunity.
Well, absolutely. It goes back to what you're asking is, are we doing a good job of educating the business? And my answer to that is no.
I would offer that we need to get in front of that, right? So part of enterprise architecture and other management professionals at your level are being able to see the whole enterprise picture. Richard, I'm sure you're doing that. And you're going to the business in a regular way, you're providing value to the business, and you're showing them ways that they can actually do a better job growing the business. And that's your job as an IT person, and even as a security person, right? Because, for instance, at Visa, when I was there, one of the things that we did for the business was to show them some areas that APT and Wiki and other things could hurt them, and then all of a sudden now they're very interested in some of the things that they thought were an impediment, right? And we showed them how to get out more CAs so that banks could put out more credit cards, other things that security could do that actually were revenue producing, right? In other companies that I've worked with in the past, enterprise architecture and others have shown the business how they can actually grow their business because they've analyzed the processes that they're doing now, right? And they've seen ways that it could be improved and grown. And together we can do it a lot better. I can name some CIOs that have really done a good job of that. Mark Egan at VMware comes to mind. Somebody at Sony, our partner at Disney some time ago comes to mind. Somebody at Lionsgate, a couple of oil company guys that actually got in front of, the video at Lionsgate? Anyway, some of the guys that have actually gotten in front of the business, right, and actually shown them how they can help the business grow, I think that's when we're doing our job, show them how we can protect it.
I think, I was telling Mike this, I know one of his advisors at McKesson, and he made a comment at a dinner that I just absolutely loved. If it had been possible, maybe I would have, if I weren't so shy, kissed him. But he said that we have to be able to speak business as a second language. And he's absolutely right. It's as succinct as that. And I really.
So you're probably aware that the Sinn organization is working with universities to try to do the cross-T program so that people that are graduating with degrees in computer science actually have a specialization in supply chain or pharma or some kind of business, because we all feel that that's important. And if you're interested in volunteering your time, we're not something. So actually, we have some other questions from the audience. How about Brenda? You have that one.
Yeah, actually, kind of along this line. So taking this in a bit of a different path. I'm really excited that not one of you is even thinking of the notion of putting head in the sand. Look, we're just not going to play the mobility in the social arena, because we can't, right? That's how services are consumed. Thank you, mobile phones, etc. On that same direction, millennials, right, top of baby boomers, getting ready to exit stage left in retirement, and knowing we're coming in with a huge amount of millennials, right, the 16 to 33-year-olds into the workforce, what kind of skills are the CISOs in the security area looking to have them equipped with? How are we going to funnel these young IT professionals into the arena of security to make knowledge of what they're doing in social and all the social media spaces, but with the appropriate security?
Well, I think I might be able to. My personal view on this, and I'm going to relate back to the comment made over here, is that in terms of the millennials coming through, my take is they're probably more equipped than those to deal with what we're dealing with at the moment. Admittedly, they need a security skill set, like IT service management skill set, that comes with training experience. I think when you're 21, you can do 9 million types of multitasking. Right. You've got to learn a skill, you learn a skill, right? And so every skill has its learning process and its experience quotient, and maybe they can do it in a few years and it took me and whatever. So I think this is a very complicated topic when we talk about the cloud concept and security in the cloud. And just listening to this, it's interesting dialogue. You know, it's interestingly, we have very similar professionals in this room. We have a lot of service management and process and IT professionals and IT management professionals, you know, all striving the same type of thing. Security is just another activity under the IT umbrella, candidly. And so how we will, you know, expend that process in a very consistent and extended manner over throughout the cloud, and how we help, you know, how we deal with this concept of extreme portability. Okay, so when I think about the cloud, this is the thing that really keeps me awake at night, you know, in terms of my ability to get the lawyers involved and write good contracts. I can outsource a bit of my storage. I really couldn't get a care less, really, to be honest with you. So we will move our servers out to providers, right? Because there's an economic equation, and I'll do my best to hook as many controls as I can. And God knows in our organisation, they may well be more robust than some of the controls we have in place. So I'm looking forward to that, to your point. But it's far more complicated, because we've got the mobility question, which with this mobile app piece going on, which we've embraced at McKesson. So I have a bring your own device program, and as an executive in our company, I sponsored it. Okay, it was a strange thing for a security guy.
Yeah.
Right? Then I turned around and said, you know what, I think we should actually pay them for it, because it's not fair if you're going to bring your own device. So we have a stipend program as well. Now for a 175-year-old company that's stoic as hell, and God knows you know what I'm talking about, right? You know, to embrace it, bring your own mobile device platform, and then we'll put Androids on the catalogue, and hey, let's talk about iPads and things as well. Now, I know the technologists in the room and technology companies probably do a lot more than we are in terms of embracing that, but we're trying to.
Well,
so we see healthcare.
And you know, that's going to be a huge draw for you to be able to attract the money.
Yeah, but we're trained, but also it's because, you know, healthcare is a mobile, it's intrinsically a mobile industry. Okay, so when you go to your physician, they're popping in and out of offices.
What do you let them do on it, right? I think one of the earlier points is very important that you probably have thought through, right? We should probably let them do some email on it and maybe a sales opportunity here and there. But you probably don't let anybody, you know, program any of the firmware or any of the dispensers that you the machines that you have to.
So our next topic is mobile in the cloud and knowing where your data is. But I do have a couple of questions
just to close out that point, I think all of this with mobility, the other one's big data, so data and healthcare, we'll talk about that a little bit. And I'm sure others are focused on that. And the cloud technologies, virtualization. So I think that will come back to this sense of IT governance. Now, if you have an IT governance model, and I think this is an underscoring of service management, I think, somewhere in there, right? If you have a pretty sort of command and control type organization, if you're a relatively new company, right, and you're lucky to have some fairly clear standards around IT and your application stack, then your governance model, depending on how you set up the organizational model, has a lot to do with how you can organize and embrace the cloud, candidly with more strength and aggression. If you're a company that's organically grown through acquisition, has a loosely coupled IT governance model, has processes that you're trying to sell the value of, basic ones like change, right, and configuration management. If you haven't got one configuration management system but 20, and you're trying to hook them together, it's a completely different conversation. You've got 2,200 vendors, and you're not quite sure which ones are cloud, which ones aren't, depending on how they categorize themselves. You know, so IT governance and all of this leads to how I think aggressively you can embrace things like infrastructure as a service and things like that.
All right, so
Robin, if I could just ask for your indulgence for just a minute. I've got Jeff. I've got one guy here who's been asking me a question for a long time. Please go ahead.
So, I think whatever problems we have discussed till now, everything boils down to control and visibility when it comes to cloud, right? And one of you rightly pointed out that we have to demand the visibility. Now the question is, how do we achieve that? A handful of providers are playing with thousands of enterprises and millions of users, right? And yet we don't have a forum where we can, make it mandatory for the cloud providers to come with a solution where they can translate that trust. One of you said that they should have top-notch security professionals. I'm sure they must be doing that. But
I don't see why the itSMF doesn't add something on to the service management framework that says cloud management, that starts defining, what these things are. Or, I don't know, there's about, 35 people here? Here's the group to start that.
Last year I was at VMware conference, and they told that their software, their virtualization layer is EL4+35. If I compare Amazon, they have done their own proprietary changes to sensors, right? But what are those changes? How exactly is it going to impact the overall infrastructure? I attended one of the conferences where Steve Riley was there from Amazon. They said, we are opening our infrastructure for penetration testing. But denial of service attack you cannot test. Reason? Because if you do that, you are going to affect other tenants. Why? Right? Then I asked, do you have any plans of EL certification? No answer. They said people are not asking.
Yeah, I agree.
My question is, why are you not asking?
Yeah, I agree with you, because if you look at the ISO 27000 series, that is the right pace probably to add a cloud section. I'm using a cloud sections, and here's the audit criteria that you'll have to review before you can actually get certified.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it's a very good point.
If cloud is an inevitability, and it is, look at how you want to implement the cloud. Do you really want to replicate the traditional model of what you're doing in your data centers, which is spinning up virtual machines, which is kind of the infrastructure, the service model bounds on finding your virtual firewalls and whatnot, maintaining all of that complexity, basically. You're just adding another layer of complexity, multiple layers, and you're making it somebody else's problem and element of it. That's not really compelling to me. If I look at it from a security perspective, I'd rather have more of that platform as a service model, which is that infrastructure is expertly managed. I don't want to have to deal with the infrastructure. Let that be highly uniform, and to rather focus on maybe restrict the development money, which is something that allows me to accomplish the goals that I want to accomplish, that is business efficient in terms of going out there and having business people develop an app and get it up and running. That to me has hope for creating a secure environment, because it's controllable and you can bound basically the APIs and the language that's being used. So I'm much more of a fan of the kind of the platform as a service approach and the application as a service versus just replicating the infrastructure.
You are from Kaiser right? Healthcare sector, very important. Now, if you have to host an application on Google App Engine, what visibility do you have? It's a platform as a service, it has a lot of
On which
services.
company?
Google also,
Okay, yeah.
right? So Google, it's platform as a service. So will you be comfortable putting your application there?
So think about it also, I think we mentioned earlier, do you have data classification? And what's your strategy for getting into the cloud governance process? If you're not having an intelligent conversation with your business to basically say, go up and play in the cloud, do some test and dev work, maybe QA work out there, that's awesome with non-critical data. Put some public information out there, that's great. Why don't you work with the security guys if it's more business information? And definitely, why don't we just all agree right now that if it's highly critical information or highly confidential information, let's not put it out there. Let's ease our way into this because the cloud is evolving, the controls are evolving, and we don't even know how to assess all of these risks yet.
And we use a selective usage of infrastructure. I have another question for you, sir. As an enterprise, when you go and talk to these providers, do you have any, because as an individual user, unless I go and hit I accept, I cannot proceed. But bigger enterprises, do they have any leeway that they can, some muscle power where they can get more visibility than a normal end user?
There's always, I believe so. So I haven't been in a position where I've had to muscle that in. But fundamentally, I think most cloud providers are going to be very resistant. And that's one of the downsides because their economies, their savings are not based on customizing things for you. It's about maintaining uniformity and maintaining consistency and allowing you to move things around. So they are going to be, I think, loath to implement something that is specific to one customer, even a large one. And I think there's probably a very significant economic analysis that goes on if they're being approached. Now, if they're hearing the same requirements from a number of different customers, hey, we need more transparency, a consistent dashboard, we need our logs, we want to do X, Y, and Z, I believe at that point in time it's in their business interest to do it. If one customer is complaining, probably not. If a lot of customers are saying the same thing, it becomes a competitive advantage for them to do it.
So there's actually some cloud companies that focus on the government sector, and they are providing not only current monitoring tools and with consoles at the customer, but some of the new generations that are coming out from Trend Micro and others. However, there gets to be a problem in that, as some of you mentioned, it becomes more complex, it becomes harder to manage, you have to assign FTEs to it. It turns out that it's a fairly intense resource drain internally, and there has to be some kind of balance economically. And frankly, one of the government agencies that I was involved with, at the negotiations broke down at that point because of the amount of resource that they would have to contribute to make it happen. It became economically unfeasible. And if I could ask for your indulgence, one more minute, Robert. Jeff had a question 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, and this is a great conversation, and it has been wide-ranging and moving quickly. And unfortunately, my question and comments are going to back up. So, one is a response to John's comment, and one is a response to what Leslie said earlier. John made the point with the quote that we need to learn to speak business. That applies to everyone in IT. If you can't talk to your revenue generators, you are irrelevant. All right, you are just plain overhead. Now, to Leslie's point about the rigor and normalcy and regulations in the finance sector, those were brought about by statutory requirements, not by it's a good idea. I mean, double-entry bookkeeping has some basic disciplines, but how you're going to treat things, it really came down to GAAP and FASB and that sort of stuff that drove down through the situation. So there's a complete lack of regulation now. Citigroup just came out that they've gotten hacked in May. The only reason they let it come to light is because the Financial Times was inquiring against them. So should there at least be, at your level, you think there should be regulations at least for disclosure? I mean, I know once they get far enough along, they're supposed to get to their client base and say, we're going to give you credit protection for the next year for free, and those sorts of things. But all of this has been drug out of them as opposed to volunteered in most cases. So
yes.
Back to the regulatory level, what do you think is required, or do you think it is required to help you get the horsepower you're looking for?
Disclosure is a tough topic because you may want to disclose, but you also are working with law enforcement, either federal or local level, and they may ask you, please do not, while we continue to investigate, do not do this. So who gets the black eye? If that was the case, let's say the FBI, Citibank notified the FBI. The FBI said, don't notify the public with this while we investigate it, because we're closing in on these guys, and don't want them to know that we're closing in on them. So now the Financial Times finds out about it. They start, making rumblings that they're going to report about it. So now Citibank has to come up with it. And now who gets the black eye? Did the FBI get the black eye for saying don't disclose? No. Generally speaking, Citibank was probably in a position where they can't even say, oh, we didn't disclose because we were asked by law enforcement not to. They just got to sit there and take it. So disclosure is a tough topic.
Yeah, I agree with that. So back in my previous report, I had the pressure, if you like, to actually write 7 times the draft press release for a security incident. So how it usually works is, an incident happens, engineer actually do diagnostics, we are somewhat sure what actually happens. And after that, we go into a room with a bunch of lawyers and PR people, and we treat exactly what actually happened. It's just something so generic, and then that will actually post it on the web. So that is how the game for public providers to play. Next time the public cloud provider go down, you see the same generic message after 1 hour because everybody's doing the same process.
Right, but the funny thing is, and I think my peers sitting up here would say, is that the general understanding now, today, by any chief information security officer, chief security officer is, you're already infiltrated. They're already in. So there's that if anyone has a fantasy that you have this really strong perimeter and you've kept the bad people out, that's not today. We
always have employees who are.
because we always have had insiders that possibly did things.
Not like this.
Not like this, but I mean, we've always had to deal with walking people out of the door.
Yeah.
And the skill is different, and it's much easier to walk out with the USB drive and have all the
Right. But one of the things that John mentioned earlier, and this was part of our conversation last week at Cornerstones of Trust, is the asymmetry. The sort of Goliath company, whether it's Juniper or eBay or McKesson or Kaiser, and this little David out there called Anonymous or Hacktivists or whomever, who have entirely different motivations. You're not competing on the same plane at all. So the asymmetry is, here you are, this big sort of hulking thing, and you have folks that are driving in. They are in our networks today. They're in our data today. And so what I find interesting is that, because I've worked with the same lawyers and the same PR people and all of that, but they just move from company to company. Is we get to the point where it's so homogenized, and it's just like, and I feel like saying, what's wrong with the truth?
I want to take a step back from the disclosure side and focus more on the question of regulation or not, which I think was the one that was asked originally. And I've kind of flip-flopped on that one over the last several years. I used to be very much of a libertarian, stay away from it, we can manage it ourselves. And
How come you're still a libertarian?
yes. But if we're looking at kind of the velocity of improvement of security controls, I think I painted a great dire picture. I see the complexity increasing. Are we keeping pace? No. Do the investments have to increase, both traditionally in terms of adding additional layers of band-aids and people and whatnot? Yeah, probably has to happen. Is it really happening? Not so sure. And the consequences are becoming greater and greater. If we're looking at state-sponsored adversaries, and I think there have been, I'm bad at remembering quotes, but somebody recently mentioned in testimony, I believe, to Congress that this is the greatest reign of wealth this country has seen in its history in terms of looking at industrial espionage in foreign countries. You ask yourself, isn't it time to rethink kind of the self-regulated approach, especially in a competitive environment? Just say you have 3 companies that are all in the same industry, basically, and they're trying to maximize their profits, as companies should. If one of them steps up and buys, if you think about investment in security, it's an added insurance policy, for lack of a better way of looking at it. They've spent extra money on an added insurance policy. It puts them at a competitive disadvantage, financially, basically. Their numbers are not going to look as good, and Wall Street is going to punish them at the end of the day if you take it to an extreme. So in a competitive environment, I think there is room to create, I hate this term when politicians say it, but a level playing field where members of an industry or all members are held to the same standard. And I think we probably need to have an evolution of security regulation that is much more, especially in certain industries, much more prescriptive than what we see currently, where we have high-level compliance standards. I know that's controversial.
Second on it. I think it's Robin's turn now.
Okay, thank you. All right, so in pre-year one stocks, I had to go out to 7 companies in a year. They all use PeopleSoft, and PeopleSoft allows you to store the admin password in the main scan. And it's just laughable today that we all have to deal with this issue. It's just gone. Okay, we just cannot happen. There was a time we had to regulate people from spitting on the street because of tuberculosis. So some of the things that we're saying, you know, a legislation is coming. We'll see it next year. It will be here. And some of this will just disappear. However, your commitment, I would like to know. I know that you're not at Kaiser and we cannot wait to hear what you're going to be next, but your commitment to fire employees who violate your policy and your commitment as our leaders to modify your security policy yesterday. For those people who felt empowered to build an Amazon data copy for $300, did you fire anybody?
Well, I don't know, it's a cloud contract, but how do you fire somebody else's employee?
I did see my first firing this year.
Right.
I did see one
See,
for that.
we're entering a world, to sort of bring this back to the cloud conversation, because I do take your point, is, you know, if you try and control it, control will run away from you. And I think that's very much the case with the cloud. And what the hell is the cloud? All we've been talking about is infrastructure as a service, is what I'm hearing. Okay, I'm cloud. You know, we provide cloud services, multi-tenant services on an application for much of the physician base, 450,000 physicians in this country. So I am a SaaS provider. Now, much of what we're talking about here is infrastructure as a service and very generic cloud, really. So with that being said, our ability to reach out under contract, generally, and affect that sort of commitment, I don't have an answer for it. In fact, if I might add, I sort of see this very much where each of us is a node, a cloud, a node, whatever the term is, but we're a piece of this complex matrix puzzle. And then I came from the insurance industry originally, right? So if you think about us all as these little bubbles, right? We're all little clouds floating around. And then on top of that, because we all provide little bits of service, right? Some of them to our employees, some of them to our customers. And then we reinsure some of those services out. So in the insurance industry, I have my risk, right? And I don't want to take it all on as a broker, an agent, or as an insurance person. So I reinsure it to parties. And we all take a bit of it, right? We all take a bit of the risk. So we're all taking a bit of the risk in this cloud environment. I don't know. I mean, is there recompense under contract? What about incident response processes? Or, you know, who accepts the risk? If there's an outage at Amazon, okay, if there's a massive one, we're going to let everybody know, but in terms of making it public, is it their right to make my issue public? But it's my data and my system, how do you make it public? Is that in the contract that you make my stuff public? These are very complicated issues, and I think we just scratched the surface. For me, they're mostly legal in the first instance, and then IT governance and operational in the next. And then I think you just sort of get over the fact that we're in this cloud and there's a customer sort of service provider sort of relationship. There's kind of the acknowledgement that we're all part of the same puzzle. We're just entering a very matrix, perimeterless, IT-based environment where the network is somewhere buried in the application protocol, right, or Facebook or something. And we're all going to be organically connected in that regard. And so how we secure that, I have not got a clue.
The lawyers are catching up though. I would say the lawyers are usually catching up, right? And during negotiations, some of the stuff is being embedded in the contract. So I see some hope there, right? Like,
yeah.
Like it's talking about consequences, right? We're right now in a multi-million-dollar deal with one of our providers, right? And we're going to walk if they can't guarantee some of the services that they will provide us, right, after the service is terminated, right, that they will wipe the personal information. Right?
Well, that's what we need, that's sort of contractual.
So there you go, right?
And that was going to be my question is, would you then, if you're going to negotiate these types of deals with a service provider in the cloud, would you think to negotiate that if they're going to fall short of your expectations, that there are going to be consequences, for those failings, because it's your business, it's your reputation. You need to make sure that when you
So
negotiate.
how does Salesforce do that now? So Salesforce externalizes access management. What that means is that they provide their application, their platform, and they make it very clear to you that I administer access to it. In fact, they'll even hook it into my identity system if I want to, right? So if something goes afoul, one, we have to determine who's at fault. Two, at the end of the day, it was my decision to go with Salesforce, they're just a provider, right? Do I have some duty of care to monitor that relationship? It's my customer that has the issue with me, not with Salesforce. So how does that extend out? A third-party arrangement? These are just very complicated situations, and your point is valid. Can't I pass on my risk to a provider? Yeah, there are vehicles under healthcare, it's called a business associate agreement, but there are limitations to it. It's capped by this, it might be. We talk about the cloud being this all very large Amazon or very large somebody else. Most of the .com outfits are using this vehicle as a very cheap business model.
You can't transfer the reputational risk. So at the end of the day, if there's a failure downstream, you're still.
So as an ancillary to the cloud, there's this kind of an iCloud scenario, right, where people are going to be wanting to use any device to access their data somewhere, right? We don't know where the data is going to be. We're a little short of authentication, non-repudiation, data in motion security, data at rest security, and about anything else you can think of, right? So what does the panel, if the group is okay with it, what does the panel think about mobile security, and especially as it relates to an iCloud type of scenario where I can tell you a couple of companies in the Bay Area that are looking very strongly at allowing their business people to access their data from any device in kind of an iCloud scenario.
The question is, are you replicating data, or are you providing a conduit for accessing the data and retaining control over it? And if I've seen extremes in some companies where they basically say, sure, you can use any device, but you only get the Citrix in, and try doing Citrix to a desktop from a have fun. Others are taking a containerized approach of using good technologies or this kind of encrypted container approach on a mobile device. Personally, having used it, it was utter nightmare, and I think it's more execution rather than the concept is completely flawed. So I think there are a number of different ways of companies are trying to solve it. There's a huge amount of innovation going on in the space of mobile security and making sure that that you can have that flexibility of getting to the point that with good conscience you can say bring your own devices in and we don't care. It's like we'll protect the company in spite of you, in other words. So I think that's kind of the end state. That's probably a year to 2 years off until we see the security industry and the vendors catching up to that. I'm not a big advocate that it's quite here yet. Until then, creating kind of that clumsy container approach or limiting the access is probably the best alternative. In terms of the data replication services, it really scares me because data is already undefined in terms of where it resides. Once you start opening it up to a more consumer cloud, whether it's something like Dropbox or Apple's fabulous new iCloud service, whatever it may be, if it actually involves replication, every endpoint device that gets a copy basically has a copy, and there's another device you have to protect. So I don't see that unless somebody creates a corporate version of that again extends kind of a container onto those devices. I don't see the consumer versions being
Or
very
maybe
smart.
it's all a Citrix thing, but the data still resides in the private cloud of the company, and it's some form of secure authentication, which is also a problem.
But with mobile devices, I think the usability element, because you're not always going to have connectivity, is going to require some degree of caching and replication of the data. So, you have to take that into account, that somehow the data has to be protected as it's replicated. I honestly hope that we're going to see a bit of a resurgence of interest in enterprise rights management, where you are applying encryption and protection policies onto kind of the units of data, the documents themselves. So, who cares where it gets replicated, whether it's sitting in the cloud or in the data center or in a floppy disk in your safe. The corporation maintains the control over the policy in terms of how it can be accessed, and you have a DRM software layer that you can manage across multiple devices. Not a software developer, I don't know how feasible that is, but to me that sounds like an interesting way out of this struggle of what do we do with the data all over the place.
I actually know a company that is doing something along that line. What they're essentially doing is encrypting hosted data and being able to send it out wherever, and each person is authorized, I guess it's key, and they're able to access it. The nice thing is that they can delegate that on to somebody else to the extent that they're authorized to do so. And those people get a key. And, if for instance it's a vendor and you're sharing health and benefit records with them or whatever, and you cease doing business with that vendor, and you start doing that, well, the big problem you're further with is how do you destroy all the benefit records that they have. Okay, here, you pop the key, and boom, when you sever that connection, you sever the access, the accessibility of that data. So there's companies out there that are doing that, or at least working on it very seriously.
They're not on the global platforms yet, but I'm hoping they understand the business opportunity and invest resources.
I can, anybody that's interested online, I can do that. I don't think this is an appropriate online environment to be promoting a given company.
But, not all mobile devices are created equal. So kind of maybe comments in between Patrick's and John's is, I used to get away with, well, what data do you really want to see on that little 2x2 screen? How are you going to really, I see people with, microscopes out to, try to do the application and all that kind of stuff. So I used to get away with, just saying, well, why don't we just really take a piece of something and you can only see this little thing. But now with the advent of the tablet technology, my whole idea is blown to hell, right? Because now you can actually get, the real interfaces. And so I think we don't know what the science is, we don't know what the techniques are yet. And so I really do like both of these ideas, the enterprise rights management, digital rights management, and also the containerizing, or actually then defining still for these little mobile platforms that you're not going to be able to have soup to nuts from the organization. You can have, the bread and the salad, and you can just see those on there. You could perform those activities. But I know my own organization is looking at, having employees buy their own devices as well. So I think that's going to get way out ahead of me being able to secure it.
Actually, you are talking about your security environment and the private cloud or the public cloud. Say we have to go through the network operators. Okay, so maybe the GGS and ITSM, if they are having a network, how do you ensure that? Okay, that's not happening about the data which is coming through the network to our cloud environment. How do you make sure? Are you enforcing any kind of rule when you make a SLA between two data centers when you sign up for the contract? How are we making sure that they are not happening to the network, right? Because nowadays, they're happening to the network, they're going to get the data for marketing analytics or whatever. So we don't know what kind of data they're getting in. And another thing is that my customer is asking me that I say, I don't want, I don't even know what I put in there. It looks like it's suspicious, so I want to know as to where it's being tagged. So is there any common way of doing this?
Well, I might take a stab at that. So for the employee, and as much as I've made some comments here, how we're going to deal with security and all the rest of it, and it's broad a concept of cloud and everything, I think it's quite a challenge, and one that if I could answer, I think it's very good business model myself in terms of the next generation of something. But that being said, I'll relate to our company. So within McKesson, so for the employee, follow is containerization of some sort. And there's a variety of vendors out there that provide that sort of lockbox type of service. That's part of it. The other part of it is, a managed device, mobility device management system. We're all looking at that, and that helps with the employee. It doesn't scale to the customer because they want to charge $20 a pop, and I can do that for the customer necessarily without the customer wanting to pass it through. We get talking about millions and millions and millions and millions of customers as a scale. So we have to look for other approaches, and strong authentication is a very hot topic out there at the moment. There's a lot of interest in the federal play around this in terms of mandating strong authentication, universal strong authentication, or strong identities rather, and a variety of ideas and things like that. But in McKesson, what we do when it comes to data, and it's because of the health data set, encryption's a piece of it. But I actually have a team that sits within my group of data scientists, and led by a reasonably well-known statistician that links with a third-party institution in the academic world that creates statistical models to do things primarily to obfuscate the data. So we create synthetic data sets for analytics, and we also create de-identified data for some of the issues you've got. See, at the end of the day, my view is I can't control everything in this company, right? It's too big. So what do I really need to control? Because my customer wants me to. And ultimately, all my regulator wants me to. And ultimately, that's a smaller subset of things. So if I think of myself as living in a campus, right? Like you see, right? Not that you see, it's not that I'm an example, Stanford or something like that. I'm in a campus environment. Okay? You don't control everything. And so I think that's what the cloud's all about. If I take that back to McKesson, it's the way I think about things. So I look to what do I have to really do? And when it comes to data, there are certain things we put so many controls around to really protect our customers' interests. There are other things that I'm probably not that concerned about, but maybe if I have time I'll get to. And I think a lot of the issues around the mobile device, to your point, kind of creating this perimeterless type device that can connect to every data center and data's flying away. So when I really look at it, what does my customer need to worry about? Ultimately, they'd like to worry about it all, but I think right at the heart of it, they're worried about their patient records, right? And so that's what I focus on, so it doesn't end up on that platform, and if it does, it's in a form that nobody cares about anyway. Okay? So it's a strange way of answering, hopefully that provides some context.
When we think about mobile data, we always think about smartphones, iPads, etc. I think my eyes got really open. I was talking to an individual that had a project where he's implementing into firmware of pacemakers security protocols, because these pacemakers transmit data out. And they needed to have these security protocols in place for European regulations. Hold it a second, mobile is a lot bigger. My eyes just, oh my God, think of all the other IT devices out there that you have to worry about.
In fact, they are profiling the level of data and the protocol level data. So, in fact, I think we are starting to similar, because all the network equipment vendors, they're trying to get into the space, and they're trying to network equipment, any, they can do any network, and they start it, and you don't know, I said, what are they getting,
So let me answer that. So cloud computing, basically, you outsource your infrastructures. So when you outsource your infrastructures, you inherit all the risks that actually will come into credit. So what happens is there are ways you can actually try to make it better, but we're not there yet. So you can say, you bring back the old IDM, identity management coming in, and say, hey, I want to know who the users go in and what they do, what can you do, and how we did it at what times and so forth. So those you can actually mimic some of the risks, but then you look at some of the cloud providers, the API, they will have one set of ID, you're offering it in, and then there was the administration, you have a total set of IDs, and when you're actually in a hybrid cloud environments, you have one set of IDs and identity in your enterprise, another set in your internal cloud, and then multiple sets in all the public clouds. So now you have to stick through all of those to actually provide the answers at the highest levels to actually answer the question is what do the people do, what they actually But you have to understand when you outsource your infrastructure, you actually outsource it and you have really no idea at the bottom what that is. So maybe ID management is one of those things with opportunities you can actually add more into it. But if you add mobile into the picture, it gets even more complicated because mobile, it's not just about technologies, it's about the process as well. So yes, we all know that you're supposed to actually put in a simple PIN to actually get to your phone, but I bet half of people you know can just slide an iPhone and talk. So you can do all your encryptions and replications in there, but people might not use it. There were products out there before that actually do TLS VPN between mobile and mobile device. Then you have to set up all these key mansions, send it back into PKIs and do all that stuff. Technology's there. Will the guy actually get the phone, put the phone, set up the key, and do all that just to be safe? Or will he just do nothing, slide, and talk on the phone, send the data? So it's a two-part of it, that not just the technology, but at the same time, there's a need to be a process in place to actually do it.
And I think also one maybe last piece, because Mike probably wants to move on from this, but there's also the notion of to make data usable or actually be readable or be able to act on it. We tend to sort of offer the whole thing at one time, and so then it can be seen because it's not encrypted. But one of the things I think that we need some of our security providers to vendors to help us with, and maybe cloud providers to be a part of this, is that maybe the data that is not readable until multiple pieces come together at one time. So there's it's kind of like two-factor, three-factor authentication of that information. Unless you have all three pieces, you can't see it. So the pieces you're getting, are meaningless.
And the challenge with that, within, at least in the health data set, is that the regulations require that not only can you do that sort of obfuscation, but that the providers and partners that you work with can't reasonably be able to recreate that data set. That's really difficult, because if you've got aggregation with cloud providers that are pulling lots of sources together, so they might have cell phone bits and pieces and a lot of personal detail, and combined with another piece of data, they could actually logically, realistically reconstruct a fair amount of that personal data set. So it's that concept of what is the risk of reassembly, thank you. And so part of the equation is to provide a level of assurance, usually through statistics, to prove that based on this relationship you're entering into, that data set, health data set, can't be reasonably reconstructed. Now, admittedly, that's just for a very unique data set, but I see that trend moving in some of the areas, potentially.
I think we have lots of
challenging.
One of the things that Gartner brought up in a couple of their cloud conferences was how do you do investigations? So it's hard to track where your data is. It's hard enough to do investigations in our own shop. Does anybody have any thoughts about that kind of thing? And that could actually be expanded to some of the things that the audience was asking about. How do you set up your original negotiations, right? So making sure that you specify that they're having enough monitoring, that they save enough information, COVID control points kind of thing.
You're assuming you control the contract.
Pardon me?
You're assuming you control the contract. Most of the investigations involve extending searches onto personally reliable cloud assets. So basically, come on with the subpoena. So, for the most part, it tends to stall with it.
I've heard there are some cloud providers, for instance, data storage cloud providers that will give you funds back. So if you have breach and you need to do that level of forensics, they will negotiate and give you that. And there are others, like Pariba. He came, the CISO Pariba came up to me right after that and he said, not us. We got one SLA alone, and we don't vary it because we open up risk to all of our other customers. And we don't allow you on the system because we open up risk to all our other customers. So it really, it's one of those your mileage may vary situations. It depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish and who it is you're trying to accomplish it with.
Go ahead.
Along those lines, how do you actually enforce company-to-company conflict of interest? Like, for instance, say we were talking about $1 billion auction site. And they're the biggest cloud player in that ecosystem is also a significant auction site amongst everything from toasters to computing, right? So, sure, they're going to write an SLA, and sure, they're going to have policies that say, no, we absolutely won't do that. But if I were CTO, I wouldn't buy it. You know, I just wouldn't think that that'd be responsible. And it's an obvious case when it's one auction site, not even thinking about contemplating the idea of hosting with our main competitor. But there are other people other players out there who have a habit of becoming competitors when we're in the space.
Like multinationals, that one multinational may acquire next week a competitor to the cloud vendor.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, so much of the providers in our
put toothpaste back in.
well, much of the providers in the McKesson space, the large ones, have their health practices, right? And probably competing systems and products, and you need to navigate that. I think it's we're all sort of customers and competitors of each other.
If you have that healthy sense of paranoia, I think that's very healthy.
How about it is, I come from a background where I don't leave a port open.
That's right.
So I definitely don't want to give you my business and put it on your issue.
But the question is, how can you design your application, your stack, so you're not reliant on promises being made? For example, when I evaluate various cloud offerings, I think one of the most accessible ones is storage as a service. Okay, so if I encrypt the data before it goes out of my system and I control the key, I could care less what my storage provider does. At home I use Mosey for backup, and I generated my own key, and it's on a USB drive sitting in my safe. And I feel pretty good about that. Obviously there are probably some implementation quirks and bad things that could happen, but I felt that I have enough confidence in the system because I control the key elements that I don't have to worry about their performance and whether they're adhering to contracts, whether they're doing everything they say. I'm not sure how you can extend a model like that into maybe decrypting memory and how to retain that control. You're leveraging the infrastructure to retain the control, possibly a product opportunity.
The technology is one challenge, and you can rest upon the assurances of the technology, but then we all know, yesterday it was Diffie Health, right? And then tomorrow it'll be, broken. And then the cat's on the bag. But a lot of what IT has traditionally done is trust the people that works for them. Then in the cloud, I've got lots of people I don't even get to see.
Yeah, I think in cloud, you cannot have the mentality of, hey, I outsource and then I just forget about that. So going back to the forensic questions, if you want to do a successful forensics investigations, I think the key is probably in the beginning, how you actually set up your incident response processes. So in this case, for example, you go two-track. Once you go set up the process, unfortunately, to actually sit down with the providers and say, who's your emergency contact, what's the channels to open, how to kick off process, all this stuff. Wrap up into SLA, back it by some financial backings if it goes wrong. Knowing that, when something happens, probably SLA will not meet, because in cloud environments, how you actually get the SLA is normally between, oh, I cannot get you the high price of lock, but you can open up a ticket and within the day I can actually respond to you. I can get you this technical lock. So you add a summation of that, that would be SLA. In real practice, that probably would not be really.
That sort of processing.
Yeah, so after you have the process, and you have to be paranoid saying that, oh, this would not work, so now you go back and do your own monitor or risk analysis and say, oh, I have application that is on the VM that go up and down, so I know I have to fund somebody to actually write something that will actually capture all those lock with centralized locations. And if I'm doing a public cloud, I know I have to replicate from one AC to another AC, with Amazon, then to S3, or then even back to my own data centers. So to loop back to the questions about what the Sony CEO do, the work does not go away. So you have to know here's the risk that you're getting with the convenience of using cloud computing, and you have to fund the part that will actually help you do forensic and instant response. So later on, moving on, you can actually.
After you engineer trust, like your positing there, is it cheaper? How do you calculate that? Because if now I have built a redundant infrastructure and a third layer of management when I already had one.
Correct.
And a new process, and I've hired a whole new department for service delivery.
So back to the question, is the cloud the right place for your most business critical functions? Put your HR out there, put your payroll out there, whatever, but if it's your business that's at stake.
Yeah, I noticed Netflix is using the cloud for shipping movies, but not for their internal finance.
Just a slide, don't slide all the way.
They're willing to lose their customer data, but not their account.
So the question I would ask would be, for healthcare, would that be a place where you would you put healthcare information out on the cloud? I mean, you know.
Yes.
Yes.
We're a cloud provider, and I can tell you now, 70,000 entities in this country do. Right?
And well, then that goes to a question about having to do something like a forensic investigation. If there were to be some breach of that information, how would you be able to do a forensic investigation of that?
We have 70,000 plus business associate agreements. They have incident responses and procedures in them. You know, occasionally from time to time, some of these entities, have some challenges or require support in some sort of data gathering exercise, and you navigate it. If it's large enough, it's very situational. It's generally out of my experience with it, it's probably not many of us in this room would have much interest in this unless you're an attorney somewhere, because the reality is I don't have much influence on that. It's a legal conversation. We have a records and information management program, which is, I'm sure we all have, similar sort of activities. It's going pretty well, and so I think, they're extending this conversation now, looking at some of these contracts and things and saying, well, is there something else we can be doing to make this easier? Because it is very traditional in its approach. So, I've got to let, whoever it may be, Walmart or somebody know within 2 hours of something happens to the data. Well, that's fine. Is there something else we can do? Is there a value add we can do that they might actually pay a little bit more premium for to get even, better service or more access into something, or even utilising some of the team and resources we have to be able to help them with the investigation? I don't know. But a lot of this is responding to the moment, and believe me, you get a large enough customer, they want something you're going to do it. So it doesn't matter what's written in the contract.
Isn't there a balance
between? I was
between?
going to say each industry's dynamics are different. Your industry is very mature. It's a couple of big players and a bunch of small ones. That's not true for, say, emerging technology industry.
I was just going to mention that in McKesson's case, isn't it true that because of what you're doing, you can prevent some of us from, for instance, in an emergency vehicle going to the hospital getting a shot or something that's going to kill us because we're allergic to it, we keep track of those kind of things. They're doing research in that area. They made some pretty impressive, I'm sure Mike could talk about, gains in ways that they can help us to stay alive longer.
Oh, yeah, the business
So,
drivers are compelling.
There's a trade-off. I mean, it's just like.
I'm just curious as to how they manage, as to how it's managed with their providers, and that was a very good answer. Yeah.
We put a lot of emphasis around, so before, there is a program, the ambulance one's probably more analogous to Kaiser, to be honest, in terms of, but it's something along the lines of we support an activity mandated by federal government in terms of what they call readiness programs, so risk programs. And thalidomide, remember that? So as a result of that, manufacturers are asked to certain categories of drugs that fall into certain, perhaps there's some adverse symptoms, or you're a type of patient this far into your treatment, you have a certain type of medication that if you or I were to have it, it might kill us, right? So in situations like that, or could provide an adverse effect, perhaps a pregnant person or something. Pregnant person, pregnant woman. So anyway.
I just thought you were being really. What-
So anyway, we combine the transaction data because we have 70 or so percent of the transactions of pharmacies in this country fly through our exchanges. So we have that immediacy in terms of, okay, you've just bought this drug, right? And some of the details in terms of who you are and where you are and all that sort of thing. And then combine that with a REMS program and a flag, and then combine that with a contact centre, and we can get out to that person pretty much before, with a bit of like as they're getting home or before that, in some way intervene and say, look, do you realise you've just bought this? And are you this, this, and this, and this? And this is the things you need to think about, and we're going to follow up and chat with you tomorrow and see how things are going. Now that's mandated, and we sell that as a service, and it's a unique idea of using, I guess one could call that cloud data, although I'm pushing the boundaries a little bit. But to get permission to do that, we had to go to every state board and get all the permission, and then we had to show everybody that we weren't causing issue with the patient right in terms of that data, and we wanted to help in terms of that process, as you would expect, to protect your patient rights. But the outcomes of that is fantastic in terms of being able to, prevent harm. And along the way, we make a little bit of, remuneration along the way, which helps our shareholders, so everybody's happy.
So similarly, there are lots of interesting things happening in healthcare. One that I've been watching is something called NHIN, Nationwide Health Information Network. And it's basically the concept that you do get wheeled to an emergency room, say you're traveling in a different state or so, that they're able to pull your electronic medical record from your providers and be able to access that. So they see the drug interaction, they see what your chronic conditions are, what you've been recently treated for, prescriptions are on, and everything else. It's coming. It's going to be there. It has a lot of interesting privacy and security implications associated with it. But at the individual level, you have to ask yourself, if you're the person who is being wheeled to that emergency room on the gurney.
I would like them to know which is medication, especially if I were unconscious and not able to tell them. Then you have the net scenario, with the net, where the data is wrong.
But I just have a question. So you as an individual are fine with your personal health information being available somewhere in the cloud world, so that your safety.
Not totally, but yeah, I understand the concept for it, but I'm not 100% totally happy about where it's been, where it is, because where I come from and my whole having grown up, in IT, all the years that I've been doing this, and all I know about it is all the years no, I'm not totally happy with it, because I know I've been hacked, I've, been involved in a lot of things. I'm not 100% happy where it's going to be. I understand the ramifications of it. I know the positive effects of, and the things that it can do for me, or where it would be. But no, I'm not 100% elated that it's going to be out there.
Well, I was at an event, I don't know, maybe a month ago, where there was discussion about the same topic, and one of the audience said, hey, I really don't care, you can have my personal health information because, candidly, what's it really going to do to me? So the interesting thing was that we were having a dialogue regarding an individual, but there's another third party inside the conversation that we haven't paid attention to. That's the insurance companies. Right? Because what they are so concerned about your health information being leaked is that someone could then be you and conduct fraud on their services, their financial activities. So in some sense, what are their rights or their interests in addition to our own personal interests, and then a company like Michael's company, that McKesson. I think it's totally wild. Same with Kaiser.
And then to take it a step further, yes, I'm all for the insurance company being able to prevent fraud against now by somebody identifying themselves as me, but on that real comfortable with them necessarily having all of my health information because they might find some pre-existing condition that I forgot to check off in some form. And then when I have serious medical needs, have my health insurance rescinded. Hopefully with reform, that's not going to happen. But, you know, I mean, I'm always worried about, you know, not only the good ways. Yeah, I want, when I'm being wheeled through the emergency room and I'm unconscious and I am allergic to penicillin, and I will go into cardiac arrest if they give it to me. I do want them to know that. I want the good stuff. But by the same token, I don't want them sending off my information to the insurance company using it to deny me, you know, the coverage I need because I was in the hospital for 6 months because they gave me penicillin.
At some point, the government becomes your insurance company.
Well, you know, it's interesting because your medical records include, and I still don't understand why this has to be, your social security number, all right? And your social security number was never, ever, ever supposed to be, excuse me, and it says this, an ID. But your social security number is out there.
It's a unique identifier, supposedly.
Well, yes, but it was never supposed to be your ID, and everybody now makes it that it's your identification number, whatever. Anyway, I've had my identity stolen twice. Not a fun thing to have for anybody. And so this is one of the reasons why, while I like the idea that a hospital somewhere in Timbuktu could have my medical information if I were unconscious and know that I'm allergic to tetracycline and it could kill me. That's great. I also don't like the fact that all of that information, including my social security number, which I have in my, you know, my identity's uneven fixed again, is going to be out there floating around for somebody to find. And yeah, my insurance company, I could care less about my insurance company having to worry about it. I care about me having to worry about it, right?
We've strayed, I think, pretty far beyond the cloud security discussion here. There are interest groups.
We have a question.
There hasn't been much of a discussion in terms of a national discussion on some of these things. These are happening, I think, in terms of like pushing technology into the healthcare sector, which is dearly needed. The stimulus bill allocated, what was it, $20 billion or so. So it's coming, but the privacy, the transparent privacy debates.
So I'll add to your comment here just briefly because I think I think you got a valid point. I mean, we're all patients, and I think the interesting reaction at the government level at the moment. I think healthcare is financial services arguably has been through this a few times in terms of regulation. The cloud is emerging, cyber threat, and all the critical infrastructure conversations, notwithstanding probably broader than this health conversation, very interesting in themselves. There's a lot of noise around health data at the moment because of the digitisation of health data and such, and it's a very emotive issue. The reaction to that is there is a new amendment